My son chose his stepdad over me after I raised him alone, so I ghosted their lives and took full custody legally. I'm a 38-year-old guy who raised my son alone after his mother walked out on us when he was barely 2, and even now, saying that out loud feels like reopening an old wound I never fully let heal. I still remember standing in the doorway that morning, Mason holding a half-eaten banana, looking up at me with those big confused eyes, while she tossed a single duffel bag in her car and said, "I can't do this anymore." That was it. No dramatic fight, no explanation, just silence and an engine fading into the distance. From that day forward, every decision I made revolved around him. I worked 2 jobs, day shifts at the auto shop, night stocking shelves, because the thought of Mason growing up with the same instability I had as a kid terrified me. I missed birthdays, hangouts, dates, entire phases of my own life. But every time Mason wrapped his little arms around my neck and whispered, "You're my whole world, Dad," it felt worth it. There were nights when I'd come home smelling like oil and dust, exhausted to the point of shaking, but he'd tug my sleeve and say, "Read to me." And suddenly, I had energy again. I became everything. Nurse during fevers at 2 a.m., event planner during birthdays, homework coach, the one cheering loudest at school plays. I didn't complain. I didn't know how to. Mason and I were our own tiny universe, and that bond carried us through more rough years than I care to admit. Still, deep down, I always carried the fear that she'd show up someday and rip open the life we built together. Every knock at the door, every unknown number, every talk Mason had with a friend about moms made my stomach twist. But a decade passed, and she stayed gone, fading into a memory I hoped Mason would eventually stop needing. By the time Mason turned 13, I finally let myself breathe, believing I had built a stable, loving home for us both, completely unaware that the next person entering his life would change everything. This happened when Mason had just turned 13, right at that awkward age where boys start deciding who they want to be, and I was doing my best to guide him without smothering him. One evening, while I was chopping vegetables for dinner, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. It said, "I'd like to see Mason." I'm ready now. My hands froze over the cutting board because I knew exactly who it was the moment I read those words. His mother. The woman who hadn't so much as sent a birthday card in 11 years suddenly wanted to reconnect. When I told Mason, he blinked at me like I had said something in another language. "My mom? My mom?" he asked, voice cracking between confusion and excitement. Part of me wanted to protect him from disappointment, but I forced myself to stay calm and said, "If you want to meet her, I'll set it up. Just slow, okay?" He nodded, but I could see the spark in his eyes, the one that scared me more than I'd ever admit. We met in a public cafe for the first visit. I still remember the smell of burnt espresso and cheap pastries, the way my palms kept sweating as she walked in with a fresh haircut, designer bag, and a smile so polished it almost felt rehearsed. She hugged Mason like she'd only been gone a week. "I missed you so much, baby," she whispered, and I felt something sour twist in my stomach. Mason clung to every word, leaning forward, asking questions, laughing at stories she told about her new life. Stories that conveniently painted her as a victim of circumstances rather than someone who abandoned her family. On the drive home, Mason kept replaying everything she said, repeating lines like, "She wanted to come back earlier, and she didn't want to disrupt our life." He sounded hopeful, too hopeful, and as much as I tried to stay neutral, something inside me whispered that this wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of a shift I wasn't prepared for. I didn't meet the stepdad, Mark, right away. At first, Mason only mentioned him in passing, Mom's boyfriend, the guy who drives a truck, the one who knows cool stuff about sports cars. I brushed it off, trying not to read too much into it. But then one weekend, when Mason came home after a visit, he dropped his backpack by the door and said, almost casually, "Mark took me to a car show. He said he wishes he'd met me sooner." I froze. Comments like that weren't innocent. They were hooks, carefully placed. I tried to keep my voice steady. "Did you have fun?" "Yeah," he said, eyes bright. "He's different. He just gets me." That stung more than I expected. For 13 years, I'd been the one patching up scraped knees, fixing bikes, helping him build science fair volcanoes. And now some guy with polished boots and a shiny truck apparently understood him better? The first time I met Mark was during a drop-off. He stepped out of the car with this confident, almost smug posture, sunglasses still on even though the sun had already dipped behind the houses. He extended a hand and said, "You must be Dad." Not Mason's dad. Just Dad, like a title he was already sharing with me. His grip was firm, overly firm, the kind meant to assert dominance. Mason practically bounced beside him. "Dad, Mark said he can help me get into a better baseball camp. He knows people." I forced a smile, but inside, something twisted. "We'll talk about it," I said. Mark chuckled lightly, patting Mason's shoulder. "No pressure. I just want what's best for the kid." That night, Mason talked about him nonstop. His jokes, his stories, his advice. And as I listened, I realized something chilling. Mark wasn't just trying to be part of Mason's life. He was trying to replace me, and Mason was starting to let him. The shift started slowly, small cracks that I kept telling myself were normal teenage moods. But they weren't. Not this time. One night during dinner, Mason pushed his plate away and muttered, "Mark says carbs at night are pointless. He eats clean." His tone wasn't casual. It was dismissive, like my home-cooked meals were suddenly some outdated habit he had to endure. I stared at him for a second before saying gently, "Well, in this house, we eat together. That's our thing." He rolled his eyes. "That's your thing, Dad." It was the first time he'd ever spoken to me like that. The next weekend, he came home wearing a new jacket. Expensive, branded, nothing like the simple stuff I'd always bought on our budget. "Mom and Mark said I should dress better," he explained, not even looking at me. "They said it might help me fit in more." I asked, "Fit in where?" "With people who don't shop at clearance racks," he murmured, as if quoting someone else's voice more than his own. That line cut deep. Suddenly, Mason was spending less time at home and more time with them. Movie nights, dinners, shopping trips, activities I'd always try to manage despite my work schedule. He'd text me late. "Can I stay over another night? Mark's taking me to practice. Mom says I should learn from him. He's got more life experience." Every message felt like another thread snapping. I tried suggesting we go fishing or watch our old favorite action movies, but he always responded with, "Maybe later," or "I'm busy." The boy who once begged me to stay home from work to build Lego sets now barely looked up from his phone when I spoke. And the worst part? He talked about Mark with this growing admiration, like Mark was the man he wanted to become, and I was the man he was slowly outgrowing. I could feel the bond we built for 13 years starting to slip through my fingers, and I didn't know how to stop it. The breaking point came on a Thursday night, one of those evenings where the air feels heavy before anything actually happens. Mason was supposed to come home after school. We had planned a simple dinner and to go over his science project together. But 7 o'clock came, then 8, then 9. No messages. No calls. Finally, I texted him, "Everything okay? When are you coming home?" He replied an hour later with a casual, "I'm staying at Mom's. We're doing something tomorrow." No explanation. No apology. Just distance. When he finally returned the next evening, he walked in with a brochure in his hand. "Oh, Mark signed me up for a new academy," he said, tossing his backpack aside. "Baseball. Way better than the one you picked." I stared at him. "He signed you up?" "Yeah," Mason said, shrugging. "He said it's time I get serious." And Mom agreed. There was a beat of silence, the kind that hums loudly in your ears. I forced my voice to stay calm. "You know that I'm your parent too, right? These decisions, they're supposed to go through me." Mason's jaw tightened. "You always make everything complicated. Mark just wants to help." That sentence felt like someone had punched me right in the chest. I said quietly, "Mason, he's not your father." He fired back instantly, eyes blazing. "Then maybe you should start acting like one instead of holding me back." I swear, for a moment, the room spun. Before I could respond, his phone buzzed. A message from his mom. Mason glanced at the screen and grabbed his jacket. "Mark's picking me up. We're going early tomorrow." He brushed past me like I was nothing more than furniture in his way. Watching him walk out that door without even a backward glance, that was the first time in 13 years I felt genuinely replaced. And as the headlights from Mark's truck faded down the street, something inside me told me that this wasn't just rebellion. This was the start of losing my son to someone else entirely. It happened on a Sunday morning, the kind that used to be our sacred routine: pancakes, loud music, lazy conversations about nothing. I was setting the table when Mason came downstairs with a backpack slung over one shoulder, his expression guarded, rehearsed. Dad, he said, not meeting my eyes. I'm moving in with Mom and Mark full-time. The spatula slipped from my hand and clattered onto the counter. For a moment, I genuinely couldn't breathe. What are you talking about? I whispered. He didn't hesitate. I've been thinking about it for a while. Mark has better connections, better opportunities. He actually understands me. The words, actually understands me, hit harder than any punch I've taken in my life. I tried to stay steady, gripping the edge of the table so hard my fingers went numb. Mason, you can visit them. But this is your home. He shook his head. No, Dad. That's just it. It doesn't feel like home anymore. My stomach dropped. Is this what you want, or what they want? He snapped, eyes flashing with anger. Stop blaming everyone else. Maybe I just need a real father figure. That line nearly brought me to my knees. I managed to choke out. I've been here for you every single day of your life. He looked away, jaw clenched. And Mark's here now. And he's doing more for me than you ever did. That broke something in me I didn't know could break. He walked past me, heading to the door where Mark's truck idled outside. I followed him to the porch, my voice barely a whisper. Mason, please don't do this. He hesitated for 1 second, one tiny, flickering second, then muttered, Bye, Dad. Without looking back, the door closed behind him with a finality I couldn't process. And as the truck pulled away, taking my son with it, I stood in the silence of our empty home, realizing that the nightmare I'd always feared had finally become real. He chose Mark. He chose the man who'd known him for months over the father who'd raised him for 13 years. The weeks after Mason left felt like living inside a house made of echoes. Every room carried a memory, his laughter bouncing off the walls, the thud of his footsteps on the stairs, even the creak of his bedroom door when he'd sneak downstairs for a late-night snack. I tried distracting myself with work, chores, anything, but every distraction ended with me staring at my phone, hoping for a text that never came. The silence was louder than any argument we'd ever had. But the moment everything truly collapsed happened at his school's spring showcase, an event I'd never missed since he was 5. I showed up early, bouquet in hand, trying to convince myself that he'd still be happy to see me. The auditorium smelled like old varnish and popcorn, kids running around in too big costumes, parents greeting each other with forced smiles. When they handed out the program booklets, I flipped through until I reached his name. Mason Carter, accompanied by Father, Mark Thorne. My vision blurred. I felt my knees weaken. They didn't even list me. I sat in the back row, staring at the name over and over, my heartbeat pounding like a warning bell. When Mason walked on stage, he scanned the crowd. For a second, I foolishly believed he was looking for me. Then his face lit up, not at me, but at his mom and Mark sitting in the front row, cheering like they belonged there more than I ever did. After the performance, I walked toward him, forcing a smile. Hey, bud, great job. He stiffened. Dad, you shouldn't have come. This was important, and I didn't want awkwardness. Awkwardness. I repeated, feeling something inside me split. He glanced toward Mark, who was waiting by the doors. Just go home. Please. That word, please, wasn't kindness. It was dismissal. I walked to my car numb, the bouquet still in my hand, petals crushed beneath my grip. Sitting behind the wheel, I finally broke, quiet, ugly, uncontrollable sobs shaking through me. That night was the lowest point of my life, and I had no idea things were about to turn far darker than I ever imagined. After that night at the school showcase, something inside me simply shut off. Not in anger, not in revenge, just sheer exhaustion. I had spent 13 years giving everything I had, only to be dismissed like an afterthought, a placeholder until someone more impressive showed up. So I stopped trying. I stopped calling, texting, showing up at events where I'd be ignored. The silence that once tortured me slowly became the only thing that didn't hurt. At first, I thought Mason would notice. Maybe he'd wonder why his phone wasn't buzzing with my usual check-ins. Maybe he'd ask why I didn't show up at baseball practice or send him reminders about tests. But days passed, then weeks. Nothing. Not a single call. Not a single, "Are you okay, Dad?" I realized he had settled comfortably into the life his mother and Mark curated for him. A life where I didn't exist. The more I thought about it, the more I recognized how deeply they wanted me gone. And part of me hated myself for making it so easy. But stepping back gave me something I hadn't had in years: mental space. I started leaving the house again, going to the gym, sitting in coffee shops without rushing somewhere. My therapist, someone I hadn't seen in a long time, looked at me and said, "You've been surviving, not living. It's okay to start choosing yourself." So I did. I blocked Mason's mom to stop the manipulative updates. I muted Mason's social profiles so I wouldn't see photos of him smiling next to Mark, wearing matching jerseys, posing like a perfect little family. For a while, I felt like a ghost watching a version of my life continue without me, one I'd never belong in again. Still, I stayed quiet, watching from the edges, rebuilding piece by piece. Because something in my gut told me this distance, this silence, would matter later. But I didn't know how right that instinct would be, or how dangerous the truth waiting in the shadows actually was. My quiet distance didn't last long before the truth started leaking through cracks I never expected. It began with a phone call from an old coworker, Jenna, who happened to recognize Mark from somewhere. Her voice was tight, uneasy. "Hey, I don't want to stir things up, but isn't that the guy who dated Claire from accounting? The one who—" She paused, lowered her voice. "Got arrested for fraud?" My heart dropped. "Are you sure?" "I'm positive," she whispered. "Be careful." The next few days, I spiraled between disbelief and dread. I dug online, searching records I had no business searching, combing through public databases and old articles. And there it was, multiple charges. Fraud, identity theft, a restraining order from an ex, a sealed case involving domestic disturbances. Each line felt like ice water down my spine. I stared at my screen, whispering to myself, This is who my son is living with." I reached out to another source, a mutual acquaintance who still lived near Mason's mom. When I asked cautiously about Mark, he sighed heavily. "Man, you don't know the half of it. People warned her, but she said he'd changed." Then he hesitated. "Look, I shouldn't be saying this, but Mark got fired last year for using someone's information to open credit accounts." My stomach twisted. "Whose information?" "That's the thing," he said, voice dropping. "He used a teenager's name." I felt the blood drain from my face. "A teenager?" "Yeah, a boy, a boy, a boy, just like Mason." That night, I sat in the dark, hands trembling as I sifted through every clue, every red flag I'd ignored. I thought about the expensive jacket, the sudden academy registrations, the new electronics Mason casually mentioned, things I knew his mother couldn't afford. A horrifying possibility sank in. Mark wasn't just trying to replace me. He was using my son. And if I didn't act soon, Mason was headed straight into a disaster he couldn't even see. For the first time in months, the numbness faded. I felt something sharper. Purpose, urgency, fear. Because now, it wasn't just about losing my son emotionally. It was about protecting him from a man who could destroy his life. The next morning, I walked into a lawyer's office with a folder full of trembling hands and half-printed documents. I hadn't slept. My mind kept replaying every moment Mason had spent with Mark, every car ride, every weekend, every smile. And all I could think was, God, what if I'm already too late? My lawyer, a calm woman named Patel, sat across from me and said gently, "Take your time. Start from the beginning." So I did. Every detail, every shift in Mason's behavior, every piece of information I dug up about Mark. When I finished, she blinked slowly, her expression shifting from concern to alarm. "You did the right thing coming here," she said. "If even half of this is accurate, Mason is in immediate risk. And the fact that his mother knew, that's neglect." She leaned forward. "We can file for emergency custody, but we need hard evidence." I swallowed. "I have some." "Then we need more," she said. The next week became a blur of gathering documents. Bank inquiries, school attendance logs, screenshots of Mason's sudden expensive purchases, witness statements from neighbors who'd seen arguments at his mother's house. My therapist even wrote a note detailing my emotional stability and long-term history raising Mason alone. It felt invasive, humiliating, like exposing every corner of my life to strangers. But I'd do worse if it meant keeping him safe. Patel laid everything out on her conference table and tapped her pen thoughtfully. "We'll file today. Judges don't ignore patterns like this, especially when a minor is involved." My pulse hammered. "What happens after we file?" "We serve them notice," she said, "and a court date will be set within days." She paused. "They won't see it coming." Walking out of her office, the cold air hit my face like a slap. For the first time in months, I wasn't numb. I was terrified, but determined. I pulled out my phone, staring at Mason's contact photo. I didn't message him. Not yet. Not until I could bring him home for real. And as I began the walk to my car, one thought echoed in my mind. The next move was mine, and this time, I wasn't backing down. The hearing was scheduled faster than I expected, 3 days after filing, and those 72 hours felt like balancing on the edge of a blade. I didn't tell Mason. I couldn't. Every instinct in me wanted to, but Patel warned. If he warns them, they'll try to hide evidence. Let the process work. So I sat in the courtroom alone, palms sweating, heart pounding so hard I thought people could hear it. The judge walked in, stern eyes scanning the room, and moments later, Mason's mother and Mark slipped through the back door, laughing about something, until they saw me. Her face drained instantly. "What is this?" she hissed as they took their seats. Mark smirked. "You finally giving up, old man?" I didn't respond. I let Patel do her job. When the judge opened the session, Patel stood and began laying out our evidence piece by piece. Bank documents, employment records, the fraud charges, the sealed domestic case, the screenshots showing Mason's personal data used for suspicious activity. Each page echoed through the room like a gunshot. Mason's mother stammered, "Your Honor, this is exaggerated. He's twisting." The judge cut her off sharply. "You knowingly allowed your child to live with a man who has multiple fraud convictions and a violent history." She went pale. I didn't think." "That's the problem," the judge said coldly. Then Mark snapped. "This is ridiculous. The kid's fine. He wanted to be with us." His voice thundered through the room, fists clenched, jaw twitching, completely losing the calm persona he'd used to manipulate everyone. The judge leaned back, unimpressed. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. You've just demonstrated exactly why this order is necessary." With a firm slam of the gavel, the judge declared, "Emergency custody is granted to the biological father, effective immediately. The mother's visitation is suspended pending investigation." My breath caught. The words felt unreal. As we walked out, Mason's mother reached for my arm. "You can't do this," she whispered, voice cracking. But I pulled away. "You already did." An officer approached me outside. "Sir, Mason will be released to you within the hour." My knees nearly buckled, because now came the hardest part, the moment my son would have to face the truth neither of us were ready for. When they brought Mason out to me, he looked nothing like the boy I'd raised. His shoulders were tense, his eyes wide with fear and confusion, clutching the strap of his backpack like it was the only stable thing left in his world. "Dad, what's happening?" he whispered, voice trembling in a way I hadn't heard since he was little. I swallowed hard, choosing my words carefully. "You're coming home with me, Mason. For now. That's all you need to know." He didn't move, just stared at me like he wasn't sure if I was the villain or the lifeline. And honestly, I understood. The first few days were rough. He barely spoke, retreating to his room, sleeping through meals, avoiding eye contact. When he finally confronted me, it was with anger. "You ruined everything. Mark said you'd do this. Mom said you were jealous." I let him shout. Let him spill every poisoned word they'd fed him. Then I sat beside him on the edge of the bed and said quietly, "I didn't take you away from them. I took you out of danger." He scoffed through tears. "Danger? Mark loves me." I handed him the printed documents, the ones I'd prayed he'd never need to see. "Mason, he was using your name, your information. He was going to ruin your future long before it even started." He stared at those papers for a long time. Minutes, maybe hours. Then his voice cracked. "Why didn't they tell me?" My heart broke a little hearing that. "Because they didn't protect you. But I always will." Little by little, he softened. Meals became conversations. Conversations became apologies. One night, while washing dishes, he whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't know." I put a hand on his shoulder. "I know. That's why you're home." Meanwhile, consequences came rapidly for his mother and Mark. Investigations opened. Accounts were frozen. Mark's charges resurfaced. And their perfect little world began collapsing from the inside, without me saying a word. That was the quiet revenge. Not screaming, not fighting, just truth. As weeks turned into months, Mason stayed close, more cautious, more thoughtful, more aware. We rebuilt slowly, painfully, honestly. And one evening, while we sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the trees, he said softly, "You were always my real dad. I just forgot for a while." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, the life we'd lost was finally finding its way back.